Ouais, j'ai, mais c'est bon. Pierre-Louis, ça module là ou pas? Non. Un 2 1 2 1 2 test.
Testing, testing. Oh, that's better. Testing. Can you hear me at the back? Mamadou, is there an echo? All good? You can hear me? Testing. Hi, tech support. Yeah, thank you. Testing, testing. Testing.
It's okay. You can try. You can try it. You can try everything if you want.
Testing. 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 This is just a quick announcement. If you're in the room and you're on the cybersecurity main session panel, if I could ask you to please come up to the podium. We'll be starting promptly at 10. So 2 minutes to 10, I'd expect every panelist to be seated. Thank you. If I could just ask the remote moderators for the cybersecurity main session to please prepare the platform. Thank you. And just let everybody know that we'll be starting in 15 minutes. Is Wim de Gazelle in the room? Just checking to see if Wim, in the best practice forum.
就中文的翻译现在到位了没有？现在中文翻译。Working now？ 中文现在在吗？能听到翻译吗？可以听到了。OK。
Channel 6 is in English, and Channel 6 is in Chinese, Spanish, and Spanish is on Channel 2.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning to all of you. Can you hear the interpretation? Channel 1 is English, by the way. Channel 1 is English.
Speakers. Channel 2 is Espanol. Channel 3 is on French. Channel 4 is in Russian. Channel 5 is in Arabic. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We welcome you to this morning's main session on cybersecurity. This is day 2, Tuesday, the 13th of November, and we're in Saleh 1, streaming in. First of all, we'd like to welcome all the remote participants who are streaming in from all across the earth, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia Pacific, from the Caribbean, and from Europe, and the Americas. So we welcome you. As you can imagine, there's translations there's translation available for this particular session. So you'll see little earpieces which you can put on. Some of our speakers will be speaking in different languages. So if you're an English speaker, you can go on to Channel 1, Channel 2 for Spanish, Channel 6 for Chinese. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed, we'd also like to take a minute of silence to remember Stan Green. As you can imagine, he brought a whole lot of marvel into the world. And so for 2 seconds, if we could please, for a minute, if we could have a moment of silence. Thank you. Thank you. In case you were wondering, he brought us Marvel, Wakanda, and Spider-Man, and a whole lot of other action animated figures. As you can see, I'm wearing my Spider-Man t-shirt, so you can smile now and relax. Yes, so good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me from the back? So how we'd like to facilitate this main session this morning is to keep the room engaged and to have a dialogue. Rather than the panel talking down to the community, we'd like to engage in a very diverse, animated, and interactive dialogue. And so to start off, let me please introduce the working title, which is Cybersecurity and Privacy Practices that can build trust and ensure growth and prosperity for all. So we're pleased to have a distinguished lot of experts that are currently seated at the podium. And if I could please introduce them. So we have Mr. Seth Bouvier. Mr. Seth Bouvier from the US State Department, if we could please ask you to stand so people can see you. We have Ambassador Long Zhu, Coordinator of Cyber Affairs from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China. We have Ms. Mallory Noddle from Article 19. We have Mr. Christopher Stack from Telefonica, well known to the community. We have Ms. Anna Hibby Becerril, who's with us from Mexico. Oh, and we have Ambassador Martineau, who is known to us. He's our host with the French government. Thank you, Ambassador, for making it this morning. And what's her name?
Microphone, please, Chair.
My sincere apologies, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, my name is Ashna Kalamela, and I work with CIPESA, which is the Collaboration and International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa. We're based out of Kampala in Uganda.
That really shouldn't have happened, and I respectfully apologize to you for forgetting. My apologies. So with that, we'd like to start off with setting the context of why we're here. As you can imagine, cybersecurity is a critical thematic space. There are lots of threats and vulnerabilities as government begins to collect data, as private sector collects data, as we're all on the internet and we live in a very borderless world and there's a lot of data involved. There are all kinds of issues that emerge in terms of privacy, in terms of security threats. For instance, we have just several months ago, there was an attack on the Ukraine power station, where there was an attack on the industrial control systems. And as governments push towards regulating their cyberspace and implementing strategies in this particular area, there are certain issues that surface in terms of privacy. We see this in Pakistan. Is there anyone from Pakistan in the room? I think Digital Rights Foundation is heavily represented in this year's IGF. We see the harvesting of data that's been abused both in India and Pakistan in recent times. And so with that, we have this distinguished lot of panelists who will be speaking about their country's different cyber strategies for those who are from government, but at the same time to sort of reach out to us in terms of how they deal with some of these dichotomies and some of these tensions. So first, if I could invite Ambassador Martin on to please weigh in for the 2 minutes. Thank you.
So thank you for having me this morning to talk about cybersecurity and data protection, data privacy. So, as President Macron said yesterday, we French government consider that stability in the cyberspace and the fact that stability, sorry, I'm I'm still out of the room in my head. If we want to keep the internet close to its promise at the origin of it, which is openness, universality, liberty, freedom, we need to make it a safe place. We need to make it a place where confrontations are limited, conflicts are limited, where we can find some stability. the difference between the kind of situation we've known for years in the real world, if I can say so, and the current situation in the cyberspace, in the digital space, is that in a way every actor can play a positive and a negative role. It's not only about states confronting themselves. It's about states, it's about private actors, legitimate and illegitimate private actors. It's about new practices that we don't want to see in the cyberspace, like hackback, reverse hacking, which is sort of privatization of war. We don't want the privatization of war. We want states to be in control of of the law. So if we want to reach these goals, by the way, I want to add up another objective, which is the fact that if we want our democracies to work efficiently and transparently, we can't accept interferences during our electoral processes. All these goals have been, in a way, gathered in the so-called Paris Code for Stability that President Macron mentioned yesterday and endorsed officially on behalf of France. These are the goals that we need to reach. And for this, we need the cooperation of states, but we also need the cooperation of every stakeholder. And this is why, by the way, so many companies have endorsed it in the previous days, and we hope in the coming days. This is why so many NGOs have endorsed it. Many more than states, by the way. Even if we have reached a very substantial amount of states endorsing the Paris Goal. So the idea basically is to work together to try and understand each other's positions and to engage into a discussion that needs to be fruitful. If we want to reach these goals, we need to invent and work on the necessary cooperative measures that we absolutely need to implement. So that would be my start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Martinon. If we could call upon Mr. Longzhu from China, if you'd like to weigh in on your country's cyber strategy. Translation is available. He'll be speaking in Chinese. Thank you, Mr. Zhu.
各位同事，主席女士，各位朋友，很高。
Ladies and gentlemen,
我们正处在一个数字化的时代。
we living in a digital era. Ethics are changing. Digital innovations continue to emerge. The internet is becoming one where the life of populations and is bringing digital dividends to the people. It's a new motor for economic and social development. But at the same time, cyberspace has brought us challenges. Internationally, internet security is under threat. Private life and copyright are under threat too, thanks to internet. Cyber attacks and cyber criminality are on the rise. Cyber terrorism is an international threat. And internet governance is not keeping pace, which is a problem for internet security. In particular, fake news are spreading, and users' data are subject to leakage and to abuse on a vast scale. enormous risks are appearing. Faced with those threats and those risks, the international community must come together to ensure universal security and shared responsibility. I think the following points are particularly important. First of all, a win-win cooperation, because our interests are shared and are interdependent. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, put forth the concept of a community of destiny in cyberspace. That's an innovative concept. That concept amounts to people coming together and unifying in order to create a cyberspace. The second point is development and security. Cybersecurity and economic growth are interdependent. Development must be the key to cybersecurity. When developing, we have to lessen the digital divide. We should not sacrifice security to development, however. The third point is that we must have rules. This must be a rules-based system. Without rules, there can be no peace or stability on the internet, and there can be no trust. Fourthly, there must be new working methodologies at several levels. China has found its own path to internet development, and I will expand upon that later on in the session. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, we'll go to civil society. You'll note that the two representatives from governments, both France and China, sort of mentioned that there's a need for regulation, and there's a need for global shared responsibilities. And so before we jump to the US State Department's representative, Mr. Seth Weaver, I thought this would be an opportune time for Ms. Asna Calamera to sort of weigh in terms of CIPESA or civil society's perspective in relation to the current public policy issue. Thank you. Ms. Asna.
Thank you. So I'll speak from a sub-Saharan perspective. We're all aware that the continent's got amongst the fastest growing internet penetration rates. Approximately a quarter of the population are internet users, and it's a huge driver in socio-economic development. Unfortunately, that growth in penetration is being matched by criminal acts against government, private sector, and individual users. We're seeing huge growth in gender-based violence online, in blackmail, extortion, fraud, harassment, and of course the theft of personal data, as well as extremism and hate speech online. These threats are cross-border and committed across jurisdictions, and ultimately they undermine the confidence and trust of use of the internet for the few, the quarter that I've mentioned, are actually online. There's therefore a need to prioritize policy and practice, as well as legislations that allow for efficient and effective stakeholder cooperation in prevention and repression of these criminal acts online. However, and most importantly, these cybercrime or cybersecurity legislations, if put in place, should not be used to curtail freedom of expression and privacy. I think we've all seen recently in Tanzania where the Cybercrime Act and legislation is used to curtail freedom of expression online and stifle critics. The same is happening in Uganda, where the Computer Misuse Act is amongst the tools used by the state to stifle dissent and critics of the state. For users, obviously, safety tools are just as important in securing their communication, so it's critical to enhance use of digital security. So there's a dire need for capacity building around digital security practices amongst users, as well as private sector and government on the continent. ultimately, of course, for the internet to be the driver that it is for socio-economic development in Africa, it's important that the policy and practice environment for cybersecurity is cognizant of the challenges that I mentioned earlier on: gender-based violence online, violent extremism, and threat to personal data. But most importantly, that it has human rights safeguards in place, so it's not used like it is in Tanzania and Uganda and other countries where cybercrime legislation is used to stifle freedom of expression and critics online.
Thank you, Ms. Asma. And would like to invite Article 19's Ms. Mallory to weigh in on the issues of privacy and the dichotomies.
Thanks. I think Ashna said most of what I would say, but I would just add that as well, there's a lot of focus in cybersecurity on conflict, as we've heard, that came up, and in other sorts of digital rights issues that are included in cybersecurity that maybe shouldn't be. And it's we see increasing securitization of these conversations, for example, around fake news. So I think that that's one trend that we have to be very clear about, that these are related issues, but they're not at the center. And what is at the center, I think, is not just the risk to infrastructure, the risk to businesses and economies. It really is people, because the reason why we care about the security of infrastructure, for example, in cyber attacks, is because people are at risk. The reason why we care about whether or not businesses and economies are viable and safe is not just because of those businesses existing, it's because of the people, the users, the workers that are involved in these systems. So I think putting people at the center of cybersecurity is a really good approach. It also means that we have a basis for talking about cybersecurity. It was said earlier that we need rules, but we already have a lot of rules. We have criminal codes, we have human rights frameworks. There already are a lot of things that we can cover with what we have already. I think what is important is actually having conversations about cybersecurity that furthers this or that adds something new rather than just a sort of general blanket securitization of everything online. And I think that, again, yeah, when we put people at the center, we can focus on things like freedom of expression and privacy. And indeed, policy doesn't go far enough. And so one way that we can make up for that policy falling behind is through technical standards and technical solutions. So that is a focus of the work that my organization does, along with many others, is to look at technical standards and how the internet is built from the ground up to be privacy respecting and secure for everyone. I do agree with Ashna that there is a lot of digital security training that's needed. At the same time, I think that the changes that we can make, the most impactful ones, will change the internet and make it more secure and safe for everyone. And that can happen at the lower layers in setting technical standards. So policy and technical standards kind of go hand in hand, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mallory. If we could move to Seth Bouvier from the US State Department. And the question we have for you, Seth, is what are some of the existing best practices from where you sit, whether legal, regulatory, or voluntary self-regulatory, in cybersecurity and privacy that have enabled trust and facilitated sustainable economic development? By the way, these questions are actually from the community, the global community.
Hi, thank you. Before I answer, I did want to just take a moment to thank you, Salva, and to thank Ben, who's not able to be here. He's in Dubai, I believe, and the MAG and the other organizers for putting this together. It's great to be here. I did just want to pause a moment, and I think the previous speakers have laid out pretty clearly a lot of the threats that are in front of us in our own ways. I think everyone up here is trying to confront them. And I did just want to interject the idea that the way that we confront them is important. And this has, I think, been brought up previously as well. But the way we address the threats are important. And the reason is we risk sacrificing a lot of the benefits of the internet. And so as we talk about the threats, I think it's critical that we also talk about the benefits of the internet as well and not lose sight of them. I'm not sure why my mic keeps shutting off. If that's something I'm doing, let me know. Yeah, the benefits, human rights, innovation, growth, I think we all have them, but we need to keep those benefits front and center of our mind as we think about how we're going to confront the problems. And in terms of best practices, to get to the question, one of the practices that's really animated our work from the U.S. side has been the risk of state-on-state conflict. And David mentioned this as well. And in fact, I'd hearken back to yesterday with the President Macron's speech, talking about the linkage between the Armistice Day celebration and Digital Week. And the idea is that as we work in the offline world to prevent conflict, we also need to work in the online world to prevent any conflict there from sort of spiraling over into conflict in the real world. And so that's what's animated our work on the stability framework. And these are kind of concrete measures. I think we'll probably get to some of them later in the discussion. Concrete measures meant to reduce the risk of activities in the online world resulting in conflict in the offline world. I think maybe I'll leave it there, but because we were talking about national strategies earlier, that was a question from some earlier panelists, I did also just want to make people aware, if they're not already, that last month the White House in the US released our national strategy, and this outlines the steps that the US government is taking to advance an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable cyberspace. It's a comprehensive document and covers a lot of ground, but I did just want to kind of throw in, highlight a couple items in there if that's appropriate. A lot of it's focused in terms of our internal practices, but much of the document as well is focused on the international cooperation that's needed around building capacity of third countries, around promoting human rights and internet freedom, promoting interoperable digital economic practices, and addressing malicious activity. And so those are some key concepts that maybe we can focus on later. Thank you, Sal.
Thank you, Seth. So with that, would like to invite Christopher Stack from Telefonica. And the question we have for you, Chris, is how can cooperation between governments, the private sector, and technical community address concerns about cybersecurity and privacy in a way that doesn't undermine an open, free, and secure internet?
Well, thanks very much, first of all, for inviting us and for being here, representing Telefonica and maybe the wider private sector. I mean, first of all, I think we have to say that cybersecurity is one of these nice issues where I suppose all stakeholders agree. I mean, we all want cybersecurity. It's not one of the confrontational issues. No one in this room would raise their hand and say, I don't want cybersecurity, I don't want to be safe on the internet. I mean, everyone would say yes. So, I mean, that's a good starting point. At the same time, we have to also say that, unfortunately, the internet and the digital ecosystem is quite a complex animal. It's very interconnected. It involves a lot of different layers. If I just one of you opens an app on your mobile phone, I mean, you have the app developer, you have an operating system underlying it, you have hardware in the phone, then it goes to a network, then it goes through some submarine cables, it ends up somewhere in I mean, it is a long value chain, and there are many people involved, many private companies involved who are working in producing these services and the products. So the problem with cybersecurity is that it's only as good as the weakest link in this whole value chain. So, I mean, of course, bad people would always go to the weakest link. So we have to make sure that this whole value chain is really secured. And that's getting more complex by the day because we're moving into an Internet of Things where we will connect a lot of things to the Internet. That means that what we connect will get, the things we connect are getting more universal, cheaper also. So, I mean, there's less money and less margins to include security measures. So, I mean, I just want to picture here and lay out a picture which is really that things are getting rather more complex than easier. What's the second issue? I think we are not really prepared equally across the world for cybersecurity. In the same way as companies are not equally prepared, we also have countries which are not equally prepared. So we have a big asymmetry across countries, across companies, across the involved actors. So that's the challenges. So what's the approach we could take? I mean, obviously, out of the challenges, we immediately see also the approach. It needs to be a horizontal, a broad approach. I mean, we need to include everyone who can help on that. Just to give you a little kind of piece of information, I mean, 80% of the critical infrastructure in the world is owned by the private sector. So governments, of course, have a huge role to play, but I mean, the business has a big role to play as well, because these are services owned, these are infrastructure owned by the private sector. We also need to have an international effort. It's good that we have national efforts, regional efforts, but in the end, this is an international issue. So we should think more about what can we do really internationally to keep it going. And the approach, I suppose, should be something which includes self-regulation. It includes some form of course, also policies, standards. A very good way of doing something which might be kind of soft law, in the sense that it's included automatically to a certain degree into products. So I think we should have a whole range of approaches to tackle that. And I think we might speak about best practices a little bit later on, so I keep that for later.
Thank you, Christoph. Whilst we're there, I'd like to ask Michael Ilishibo if there are any interventions from the remote participants before we go to the next speaker.
There is none at the moment.
Thank you. So with that, if we could ask Ms. Enehibi, who's a researcher with the Public Center for Research and Innovation in Information Technology in Mexico, to weigh in on the current discussions. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Good morning. I'll be speaking Spanish. It's more comfortable for me. Thank you very much for your invitation and for giving us an opportunity to share our ideas with you. In Mexico, last year, we enacted a national cybersecurity strategy. Not that we hadn't done anything prior to that, but this strategy amounted to sitting down together and joining forces in order to get a clearer idea of what we're doing and how the different stakeholders could be involved. The national cybersecurity strategy involved a group of many stakeholders. There was even a public consultation so that any individual could express him or herself on this and on the situation of cybersecurity in Mexico. It's very important to point out that Mexico is making a great effort to assist other countries in the region in order to spread the culture of cybersecurity so that countries will be prepared for this. In our experience, Mexico's strategy is based on 3 principles. First of all, human rights. All of the matters that we have to implement in cybersecurity have to respect the principles of human rights. Also, a risk-based approach and a multi-stakeholder cooperation. Not just multi-stakeholder, but a multidisciplinary. So we involved these principles in our strategy, but the strategy is just a first step. Now we are looking at the second step, implementation. And one of the things that we discussed is that there's going to be a change of government soon. It's very important for countries to ensure continuity to programs. We can't, every time there's a new government, start from scratch. Many times when a new government comes in one of our countries, they tend to start from scratch. So it's very important to make sure that the documents are drawn up by many stakeholders, not just by the government, that academics are involved, that the private sector, that civil society are involved. The government acts as a coordinator, but all the involved parties have an opportunity to speak and to create this document. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Enehibi. So with that, I'd like us to go to something that Seth Bouvier mentioned, which is state-on-state war. And that brings us to one of the other emerging policy questions that the community sort of raised when we were preparing for this main session. So the question is, and I asked this to Mr. Sepp and then to Ambassador Martinov and Mr. Longju, what are some considerations for cyber diplomacy in the development of global norms and best practices, whether it's related to states, organizations, and individuals? And how can geopolitical tensions impact global norms, and how can this be mitigated? So you each have 2 minutes.
Thank you. So, well, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I guess the way I'll start, and we can go from there, is to talk about the diplomatic efforts that we've been involved in for many years at the United Nations. The UN has really been central to these efforts to build consensus on international security concepts. And so we've promoted in the UN and elsewhere, but what we call, we've thought of as a stability framework. So the idea is, you know, we're promoting this framework of stability to prevent state-on-state conflict. And it's really has 3 pillars. One is promoting the agreement that international law applies to state behavior online. The other is promoting certain non-binding norms of state behavior that apply during peacetime. And the third is promoting what we call confidence-building measures. These are kind of concrete measures that states can undertake to promote mutual understanding and you know, prevent conflict. And so a lot of this work has taken place at the UN. Some of it's taken place in other fora. This year at UNGA, we actually had a cyber resolution, to, well, before I get to that, I'll mention the GGE, the Group of Governmental Experts, and this has been a venue that's been very productive since 2009 to build support for this framework. And it's really been a productive and useful platform to talk about these issues because it's consensus-based, it's time-limited, and it's expert-driven. And a lot of attention's been focused on the 2016-2017 round of discussions where there was a failure to find consensus, but of course that doesn't invalidate the existing GG recommendations of the previous report, which were, as I said, groundbreaking. And so to try to keep that momentum and progress going, we tabled a resolution at this year's UNGA First Committee. And it really mirrors the previous consensus resolutions seeking to make progress. This happened last week, and we're pleased with the overwhelming support that the resolution received, and we think that this is going to enable, or we're hopeful anyway, that there'll be a new GGE that will reach consensus and actually expand its ability to consult more broadly during the process. And so that's, I guess I'll leave it there. I mean, that's the diplomatic effort that I would kind of put into the discussion at this stage. Of course, there are many others.
Thank you, Seth. Ambassador Martinov or Mr. Longju.
谢谢主持人，我也想借此机会。
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I should like to present China's view on the topic. You see, in order to be able to maintain cybersecurity, all the while maintaining internet openness, well, that's in the interests of us all. But how can we achieve that objective? What is cyberspace, after all? There are different interpretations, different views on the topic. From my vantage point, cyberspace differs greatly from the physical world we inhabit. Having said that, cyberspace is not completely disconnected from the real world. And it is for that reason that in the real world, we have certain principles which are jointly recognized and jointly implemented by all of us, enshrined in the United Nations Charter. In fact, these principles also apply in cyberspace. They should. I think that's the bedrock of global internet governance. However, unless those foundations are in place, internet governance will be unsuccessful. From our side, given the fact that cyberspace is special, it has its idiosyncrasies, given the rapid pace of technological development, we believe we need innovative ideas in order to be able to govern the internet. In line with this process, we're of the view that we need to uphold certain principles, specifically the principle that we all have a common destiny in cyberspace. We need to focus on this idea of shared development. After all, we're all inextricably linked in cyberspace, and this is why we need to cooperate. My colleague from the United States mentioned processes underway at the United Nations, and we're taking a very active part in these UN-led efforts. We think this process needs to become even more inclusive, bring even more countries into the fold, so as to be able to ensure fair and sustainable development and governance.
Merci. Je voudrais...
Thank you. I just wanted to add to what Seth and Longju said. Seth referred to the work being done by the group of government experts under the auspices of the UN. All three of us were members of that committee last year, Zhu as well. And I think over the last few years, we've made tremendous progress in that body. We've worked very hard on some of the conditions which Seth mentioned. Now, this is an expert group with a very clear timetable. It's just a few people putting their heads together and negotiating. And the outcomes we achieved were important and, in fact, very interesting. This is something Drew said. It is now widely accepted that international law and that the United Nations Charter do apply in cyberspace. So in contrast to what was said a little earlier, we didn't come up with new rules or new norms. However, what we did work on, successfully in fact, was the setting of certain voluntary behavioral standards for states. And the English of that document states states should or states should not. That's how we worded it. And this is this new cyberspace-driven grammar, which we tried to craft, and I must say we were quite successful. Today, the state of play is such that during the last round of negotiations in 2017, we didn't manage to craft a consensus. We spent about 4 weeks working very closely all together, but at the end of the day, we didn't manage to garner an agreement on all of the points we debated. Therefore, we're going to continue working hand in hand, and Seth told us about the current UN context. 2 resolutions were passed, the first tabled by the Russian Federation and the second by the United States of America. Of course, it would be better to have one consensus-based text, but we currently have 2 texts on our hands, and we have to live with that. We want our efforts to be as productive as possible, so we have, once again, a group of governmental experts which is going to work. It's a small committee bringing together experts who are going to try to shed light on international public law and new behavioral standards which we're trying to set. We'll also have an open-ended group. That means that any UN member state which wishes to do so can take part in, and this open-ended working group will not be time-bound. There's no deadline for them submitting some kind of solution. Perhaps it's not the best idea not to set a deadline, but we are going to be part of that process. The French government is going to take an active part in that process. During the last round of negotiations, what we noticed, I'm referring to 2017, the 2017 round, is that there are a number of new issues cropping up, which we've pinpointed. And when it comes to these new issues, interstate cooperation is by all means necessary, but we also need to go above and beyond. And when we do this work, this standard setting work, we also need to include other stakeholders, specifically the private sector, especially software companies, the software producers. What are these new issues that we've seen cropping up in cyberspace? First of all, hackbacks. That's reverse hacking, private counterattacks. I mentioned this already, but I just wanted to underscore that. We, the French government, do not want the privatization, to see the privatization of law and order. We want the states to retain the monopoly on maintaining public order in cyberspace. That's the first thing. Second, another issue on which we've already set a standard at the interstate level, but we think we need to go one step further, in fact, much further. And here I'm referring to control of malevolent tools being deployed in cyberspace. This is a very complex, very thorny issue. And it calls into question whether these practices, these tools are tangible, how tangible they are. But in fact, this opens the door for companies all over the world to destabilize the delicate balance that's been struck. Interstate cooperation on this topic would of course be beneficial, and it is beneficial, but we also need to work with industry, with the private sector, so as to pinpoint which systemic players are responsible. By systemic players, I mean all industries in which market share, including across different markets, especially the software development market, is distributed in such a fashion that certain players can affect the entire cyberspace. WannaCry is one example. There are others. In other words, we've seen malevolent, unscrupulous actors, public and private, sometimes private actors, acting on behalf of public actors, using devices, using software, and exploiting their weaknesses. We believe that if we can bring cyberspace instability to a minimum, if that's what we want to do, we need to ensure that the products being offered on the global market, these products need to be secure so as to reduce vulnerability. Unless we manage to make that effort, unless companies agree to shoulder their part of the responsibility burden, we won't be able to confront that challenge. And this is why we kickstarted this conversation. We did this with a number of companies. These companies are aware of the challenges. Microsoft is, so is Siemens. We discussed this with them as well. They kickstarted the Tech Accord together with Microsoft. We talked to other companies too. They have a certain responsibility in this sphere, and they're ready to take action. So we've been working with our partners because time is of the essence.
Mr. Martinov, so there were several things that were led within the interventions by the 3 different government representatives from France, China, and the US. Now, one of which we would like to pick up on is a comment earlier by Christophe when he said that 80% of the global infrastructure is actually owned by private sector. And so one of the things that Ambassador Martinov raised was in terms of increasing accountability amongst corporations. And one of the things that he raised, which I'd like to put to the panel, one of the things he sort of raised is, whilst governments and through the government experts that have been negotiating the text, and obviously there are two consensus texts, am I right, Ambassador Martinov? You said there are two consensus texts. Whilst the delicate balance, two texts but no consensus, sorry. Two votes, but no consensus. I hope that's been transcribed. Yes. So while that's happening, whilst the delicate balance can be struck because governments don't necessarily control the infrastructure, I'm not saying control, but don't necessarily own 80% of that infrastructure, they feel that there's a need to insert some level of accountability mechanisms. And earlier we heard from Ms. Mallory when she was from Article 19, as she was talking about them engaging in standards. And throughout the week we've heard of different workshops and different sessions talking about transparency, particularly in this particular area. And so with that, I'd like to ask Christophe to please weigh in.
Yes, thanks. I think I would like to follow on where Ambassador Martignon stopped, which I think was an excellent reflection. Of course, I mean, I said before that self-regulation is one of the key approaches we also have to take. I mean, due to the fact that business is so relevant in cybersecurity. And I'm happy to say that my company also signed the Tech Accord, for example, where we try to do that and we try to work together. By the way, there are more than 60 companies already, and it's a growing number of leading tech companies in the world who basically agreed to work together to make cyberspace safer. So I think that's a good example of a self-regulation, of an initiative rather, to work on these issues. It is, I mean, they are mainly, I also should say that very openly, companies from the United States and Europe. We haven't seen that as a global initiative yet, and the question would be, why not? You know, I mean, why can that not be expanded? Because actually, as I said before, there's a common interest of making cyberspace safe. That's one approach. There are other approaches. Just to mention, GNI, the Global Network Initiative, is working on privacy and freedom of expression. We also are a member of that initiative, and that's actually a good initiative as well, because we are working also between companies to share experiences and to see what best practices are. There are very thorny issues about access to data by governments, for example, where of course, you know, human rights need to prevail, but we all know that this is always a difficult question, security and privacy, and which kind of right prevails in a certain circumstance. So we share experiences, we try to work together, we try to work with governments to make them also aware of the work we do, and I believe that as a collective we can achieve much more in having a fruitful dialogue there. So I think these are issues. I also have to say that apart from being prepared, apart from being aware of human rights aspects also in cybersecurity, you also have to think about what do we do when things go wrong, because at a certain point of time things go wrong, and WannaCry was mentioned. It was a good example. Suddenly things went really wrong. And again, I can share to you that I think my company, Telefonica, was one of the first which reported that incident and was transparent about the fact that there was something going on which was unusual. And we did that through a system which the European Union established, which I think is also some best practice, which is a system of national reaction centers. So every country in Europe, by common policy in Europe, is obliged to have a national cybersecurity reaction center, and basically we as companies are obliged and have committed to inform these centers when something goes on. So there's a measure of transparency, and then they communicate that immediately to the others, and so there's a kind of process of incidents which then help to react fast. And we used that process when we were hit by WannaCry as well. And actually was very fruitful because you could immediately connect to a lot of people working against this kind of attack. And my company, for example, published later on even help to smaller companies how they can work regarding WannaCry and what they can do about it when they have been affected, and we opened that up to everyone, and it was used by many companies. So basically, you see that there is starting from the point of a common objective of we would like to make things safe. I think we can find a lot of ways to work together between governments and companies, between civil society and companies as well to get there. I think we have a lot of common interest in making that happen, and I think we can find a lot of ways to do that. And we are just experimenting with these different instruments, which are not necessarily only policy making, and there can be standards, as we said before, and other needs. But I think it's important to have this this common idea of we are here to do that together.
Thank you, Christoph. Now, before we pose the next question to the civil society speakers who are currently on the panel, to Ms. Asma and to Ms. Anahibi and Ms. Mallory, we'd like to open the floor and ask for questions. If there anybody who'd like to make an intervention. Now, I'd like to ask you to keep it at a minimum of a minute. So, can I see the hands? Sorry, somebody help me? Yes, would you just like to stand so that we can see you? Yes, Adam, please go ahead. Is that Adam? Sorry, my apologies. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Hans Klein. I'm from Georgia Tech and Princeton University. I have a question for Ms. Mallory from Article 19. I'm concerned in this whole big discussion that we're having here at IGF with the President of France giving the speech and all, we're hearing a lot about internet security and the need for government regulations and the dangers that are out there. Just the word danger, danger, danger seems to be omnipresent. And I'm wondering if, concerned that this isn't in fact, an approach that leads to greater state intervention and control over the internet and a decline in internet freedom. So I'm concerned that constantly hearing that the internet is dangerous, we need the government to save us, is in fact a way of perhaps scaring us into the arms of the government, if you will. So my question to the panel, but perhaps to Ms. Mallory, because she's probably, I regard her as the most independent person here, what do you think of this? Are we being corralled into the arms of the government,
please.
or not?
I think you passed your 1 minute. Thank you. Could the rest of those who put their hands up, could you just please raise your hand right up so we can see? Yes. Can I take you, Dr. Yeek? Thank you.
Yeah, my question is go to the U.S. government and Chinese government officials. Actually, we heard a recent Bloomberg news report on the hacks of the infrastructure, which is claimed by Chinese spies. So this is a kind of the infrastructure problems. So my question is, how can we build up the trust if one country accuses other country for like spies or cybersecurity attacked at the infrastructure level? Thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Yik Chen. Yes, can I take the middle speaker before I take the one on my extreme left? Thank you, please. Please introduce yourself, state your name and then your question, and keep it under a minute or your intervention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Ethan Sweet. I'm a youth at IGF Fellow for the Internet Society. So my question is mainly about what David said about the role of private companies in internet security. Obviously, as we've mentioned, that 80% of global infrastructure is owned by private companies. And a lot of them I've seen seem to shake their responsibility until something terrible happens. So, for example, in the Internet of Things space right now, it appears that security is quite an afterthought. So how do we go about encouraging and pushing companies to not bake in security as an afterthought and to bake it in as a default into their systems? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 3 more questions. Sorry. Could you just stand up so we can see you? The lighting is not too good. Yes, right at the back there before the lady in front.
Hello, my name is Michał Woźniak. I work at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and I'm responsible for security of a lot of journalists. So I have a question. I'm happy that the phrase WannaCry showed up. I noticed that NSA has a budget 2 orders of magnitude higher than US CERT, which is an interesting statistic. I also noticed that WannaCry used the Eternal Blue exploit that was developed by NSA and then leaked. So my question is to the representative, the honorable representative of the United States. Are you inclined or ready to take responsibility for the WannaCry attack, which was using a exploit developed by the NSA? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take, yes, could you please stand up? Right, I got you. Can see you.
Voy a hablar en español.
I'm going to speak Spanish. My name is Maria Nela Baldi from Venezuela, from an NGO to defend journalists. I have a question, Mr. Steck. You spoke about resolving conflicts between state and non-state stakeholders. Venezuela is in 19th place, the Freedom House rating of the countries that have most restrictions on the network. And along with UNI and an internet open observatory on internet intervention, seeing serious violations. We have. Sorry. You're what? And I'd like to ask how Telefonica solves these problems of conflicts between state and non-state stakeholders.
The 2, please, before we get the panelists to respond. And I'd like to ask the panelists to feel free to merge their responses. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Muriel Thibierge. I work for communications and systems in cybersecurity. We have in France a lot of cybersecurity associations, and I believe, and my question is to Mr. Martinon, I believe this is a major stakeholder, this community of associations that have insight on the cybersecurity subject, and I would like to know if it's possible, we kind of know our counterparts within Europe, so other cybersecurity associations within Europe and also abroad. Thank you.
Thank you. One last intervention before we bring it back to the panelists. Yes, please, introduce yourself.
Gracias.
Thank you. I'm from Paraguay. Just briefly for Mr. Martino, I listened to his opening remarks, and my question is, are we not going from criticism of hate speech to criticism of fake news to fear of the internet, of insecurity in cyberspace?
Just before we bring it back to the panelists, if I could just ask the Michael and Lishibo if they're remote participants' interventions. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, there's one question, I think from Mokaberi. He's asking, unilateralism and nationalistic policy is against forming any global and democratic and transparent law-based system in internet governance under UN framework. In reality, we have only one school of internet governance. Does America First School of Internet Governance allows internet of trust and laws-based system formed? What is the meaning of other schools of when there is no democratic and transparent of internet governance model in ICANN under US jurisdiction? The greatest enemy of digital cooperation and internet of trust, in brackets, is digital unilateralism and digital protectionism. With this approach that is clearly reflected in us, National Cyber Strategy 2018, how other countries can trust us, owned and controlled internet. US unilateralism and nationalistic policy will soon lead to internet fragmentation. What must be done?
Is that the only intervention?
Yes, that's all one so far.
So with that, I'd like to invite Chris to first respond.
Well, I will not respond to all of that, but I will respond to the ones who went to, if I understand, to me and to the private sector. I mean, there was one question about how can we encourage responsibility of the private sector and how can we make that happen. I mean, first of all, I think a lot of companies are aware and are already doing something. I mean, I gave some examples. That's of course not maybe, I mean, there are different intensities of responsibilities of companies who take it more serious and others maybe who don't see it so much. So a little bit cynical answer to that would be everyone gets responsible when you get hit by cyber attack. I mean, the moment you have experience as a business, if you're big or small, an incident, you will be very much aware that there is a huge risk. I have just read a report saying that the risk of cybersecurity incidents over the next 3 years will go up to something like $7 or $8 trillion. That makes it the biggest risk for business in the world. I mean, there's no bigger risk. It's bigger than whatever illegal drug dealing and so on. I mean, it is an amazing economic risk and therefore also for companies. So I believe that, I mean, the pure fact of these risks will move companies to do something. Of course, governments can help. Of course, civil society can help also and I think there are good initiatives around to also have this dialogue to make people aware. But as I said, a lot of people, a lot of companies are already moving. And there was a question about Telefonica and what we do about human rights, if I understand correctly. And basically, I mean, as I said, we are part of GNI. GNI are companies who agreed to defend human rights where they operate. We operate in more than 20 countries in the world, and we have global standards, global politics inside Telefonica, so we are not making differences. We have committed in our business principles to human rights, we defend human rights, and we have these dialogues with civil society on the ground and with governments. Having said that, I mean, of course, it's a long-term process. We cannot change political systems, and we can also not do wonders in short term, but I can tell you that there's a clear commitment from Telefonica and many other international companies to uphold human rights.
Thank you. And if I could ask Seth Boyver to please respond to the questions that were directed at him.
Sure. I think I had a few that I wanted to respond to. The first in terms of infrastructure vulnerabilities and compromises. I think that's a topic that's of great concern for everyone in this room, you know, governments included. I would say, you know, this is an area of interest and priority for the U.S. government. The additional complication is that there are sometimes reports in the media which may or may not be accurate, and you know, I would suggest that if people are interested, they listen to what the U.S. government says about attribution for things, or what we say about what we believe is happening. And I guess I'll just use that as an opportunity to segue to the WannaCry. I think we've been very clear about who's behind that and what that was, who was responsible for that. I don't think there's really any disagreement about that. But I would use this as an opportunity to harken back to what Christoph was talking about, the certs around the world, and the criticality of this particular function. The U.S. has put a lot of time and resources into developing certs around the world so that we can better cooperate around incidents and vulnerabilities. And another piece of this to just highlight is that we've begun using in the last couple of years, using our diplomatic tools to augment the cert-to-cert channel, and using diplomats to approach foreign governments to give a little bit more context or a little bit, or prioritize certain cert-to-cert communications so that for truly critical incidents, we can have a sort of quicker, better response. I believe I had one more. There was some reference to America First internet governance. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I would just point whoever asked that question to the National Cyber Strategy that was released by the White House last month. I think if you look at it, you'll see that there's a pretty clear acknowledgement that the threats to the cyberspace are international, come in different forms, and we have to coordinate and collaborate across governments, across sectors, across stakeholders to disrupt them. There's the commitment to the multi-stakeholder model is as strong as ever. and international collaboration is kind of the bedrock of how we have to confront these global challenges. So I wouldn't call into question those principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. There were some questions directed at civil society, particularly to Article 19, Ms. Mallory. But before that, I thought it would be a prudent time to pose one of the public policy questions, which is sort of related to that, so that you can also just merge your interventions. So the question is, how should policy making approach and accommodate the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy? Are the two mutually exclusive, or, you know, are there tensions between these concepts, and are they mutually reinforcing? Are there trade-offs that need to be made between the different elements to help engender trust?
So thanks, Hans, for your question. I really like the theme of the IGF is about trust, and the trust is in the title of this panel, but yet we haven't really talked about it much. And I think that Hans pointed out a really good tension, which is that when we're back to what I said earlier about securitization, if there is all this sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt that forces all these conversations into one about cybersecurity, then it is really counter to the idea that we have to build trust. So I don't know that they actually work together very well, but I like the attempt at framing this as an issue of trust, and that is sort of what I had prepared to talk about mostly today. And so I can just give you the very short version of what I was going to say, which is that I think that governments and private sector probably have trust between them. They work a lot more closely on these issues, but that leads to some, at times, unfortunate outcomes for people, right, who are left out of it. So again, I'm going back to, like, we need to have people at the center. So when governments and private sector work together closely, they mostly focus on things like intellectual property and preserving, you know, economic stability, things like law enforcement agency access and things like that. And a lot of the concerns that people have and human rights are often not a priority in a sort of those two stakeholders working together relationship. Another thing that can sometimes happen is that people are seen as the threats. So in most cybercrime legislation I've read, a lot of cybersecurity strategies, if people are mentioned at all, they're often mentioned as the problem. So either through malice, hackers are a problem, or through incompetence, like people don't know how to use their Internet of Things, it's going to be a huge problem, but the people are the risk, right? Instead of flipping that around and talking about how people are the ones we need to protect, people, like the general population is seen as the unknown and the threat. And then technical expertise can also sometimes be seen as suspect. There's an increasing criminalization of technical expertise. And all of this is to say that I think that really erodes trust. But that's a problem because, you know, who are the ones who place trust in these institutions? It is people. And the institutions are the ones who must be trusted.
Thank you, Ms. Mallory. We just need to rope it back in because we're running short of time.
Sure. I would just like to support what Seth said about multi-stakeholder models and multiple competencies of embeddedness. So there are essentially two sort of models for trust. One is...
Pause. Yeah. Thank you. If I could ask Ms. Anahibi to please weigh in on the current discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. When it comes to the question of how to ensure the responsibility of companies, there are legislations, for example, to require companies to report on data breaches. But there are other legislations that don't provide for any such things. So there's no perfect formula. There are many disparities between countries. But for example, in the United Nations framework, they're the guiding principles, companies and human rights, where it is said that international or multinational companies must refer to that framework for respect for human rights. Another way that companies may participate is sharing information when an incident occurs. Many companies don't share such information because that could have an impact on their reputation. So I think that it's important to see that all the different stakeholders have different but complementary responsibilities. What we're after are common objectives, both the the government and the private sectors and the final users need information from cyberspace. Governments also suffer attacks, so we have to work on this all together. Thank you.
And Hebe, with that, would like to ask Ms. Asna before we go to the government representatives to the final remarks.
Thank you. So obviously from a sub-Saharan African civil society perspective, we recognize that the threats are real. They exist and they undermine privacy and security and trust in use of the internet. The challenge, like I mentioned earlier on, is the use of cybercrime legislation to then curtail freedom of expression and privacy amongst other rights. It's great to hear from the government representatives that there are a lot of efforts underway to ensure, more efforts and commitments from states to uphold human rights while enforcing the law online. In terms of the policy imbalance that you mentioned, I think the challenge for African states is that there's little consultation or participatory policy development. And we've seen that in the case for Tanzania that I mentioned earlier on, the cybercrime law, which is one of the key instruments used to undermine human rights, was passed literally overnight with little consultation or stakeholder participation in its development. So it would be great if states and regional and global bodies are holding some of these states to account in terms of their commitments to international standards. For the private sector, civil society and other actors, again, like I mentioned and has been mentioned earlier on, digital security practices are not that great on the continent, and there's a need to adhere more on those. And something that the representative from the private sector mentioned is that the challenge for most of the actors on the continent is balancing human rights and other interests. But ultimately, yes, the threats are important, but participatory policy development and holding states to account to international commitments, but also ensuring that any policy and legislations that are passed are participatory and consultative.
Thank you, Ms. Asna. And I believe, Mr. Zhu, you have comments to make before Ambassador Martino.
谢谢。本届论坛期间。
There have been a lot of discussions in this forum on regulation by governments, by authorities. I would like to speak about the way we do things in China. I said that China had found its own path thanks to the efforts made by all the Chinese stakeholders regarding internet governance. In China, we say that only the wearer of the shoe knows that the shoes fit him. If whether or not Internet's governance is well adapted, only the Chinese users can know that. We've seen that there's been a rapid development of the Internet in China. A lot of innovations have occurred, all of which have been to the benefit of economic and social development. The Chinese people took great advantage of that. During that process, the direction provided by the government has been important. But the efforts of the private sector and civil society, the participation of the population, are just as important. The government can't control everything, nor does it want to. The reform in China has entered a new era. Everyone is innovating. Everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. To transform our productive capacity. Companies played a major role in internet governance, such as the giants such as Alibaba or other internet giants, co-signed an initiative then the technological community takes an ever greater role in internet governance in China. They organized lots of workshops to contribute to internet governance. Our exploration is continuing, and so is cooperation. Thank you, but we have no more time.
Remarks before I make the last closing statement.
Merci.
Thank you. I didn't think that we would wrap up so soon because I had lots of questions that I'd have liked to answer, but let me deliver some general conclusions. For the first time, I attended IGF 5 years ago, and 5 years later, we're hosting the IGF in Paris. I continue to see the same incredible distrust by civil society with respect to the state on any subject. 5 years ago, we were discussing cybersecurity, whereas today it's on everyone's lips. And what do I hear? I hear Mallory saying, with all due respect to him, that in our reflections on cybersecurity, the people are not at the heart of our reflections. Well, if not, who is? When we think about cybersecurity, it's to prevent people from having their life savings stolen online or their data stolen online. When I hear my colleague from Georgia Tech say that the cybersecurity risks might push us in the arms of the state, well, yeah, yes. In my country, when it comes to peace and war, it's the state that decides. We are seeing a situation where instability in cyberspace has not yet produced civilian or military victims. No one's died from the cyber war yet. But with WannaCry, how many hospitals were put out of order for many hours? There were no victims, at least not officially. But when the main electricity suppliers in the Ukraine can't function for several days running in the midst of the Ukrainian winter, well, maybe there hasn't been a death, but there will be deaths in the future due to the cyber war. And that, when that day comes, I can say that in France, the French citizens, the voters, will not turn to Orange and ask them for their to show the responsibility because they were hacked. The French will turn to the government and they will ask us what happened. They will hold us to account. So I would like to ask you, and I'm going to be leaving my job in 2 days. You won't hear from me anymore in the IGF. I will be leaving the digital scene. But I would like each of you to make an effort to overcome this absolute distrust in the state. I'm speaking on behalf of the French government. We've been a state of the rule of law for more than 2 centuries, and laws on cybersecurity are subject to a democratic oversight. It's not a question of our dominating anything. We want to safeguard the common weal. Yesterday, the President of the French Republic launched an appeal for cybersecurity amongst the stakeholders. So let's build some trust, otherwise we won't get anywhere.
President Marinov. Ladies and gentlemen, we started off with exploring building trust in the context of cybersecurity, and particularly exploring the dichotomies and the pull and push and the tension between privacy and cybersecurity. And I have the pleasure of announcing that the Best Practice Forum on Cybersecurity, is there any representative of the BPFs here for cybersecurity? Is Wim de Gazelle in the house? Or is Marcus there? Yes, Marcus, could you please just give a 1-minute plug-in of your draft report that's currently available online?
Yes, Marcus Kummer speaking. Yes, we have our Best Practice Forum session tomorrow morning. And I don't have the exact time and room under my hand. I think it's 10 something. Draft report is up, and this session will essentially look at the input we received and conclude then with the report, which will go forward to the community as a result of this year's Best Practice Forum. So I hope that many of you who are interested in this issue will join us tomorrow morning for the best practice forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. And the draft report is particularly interesting because it explores the notion that privacy and cybersecurity are not mutually exclusive. So with that, please join me in giving the distinguished panelists and experts a big round of applause. Thank you also to the remote moderator, Michael Ilishibo, to the remote participants who are streaming in from all across the world, the NRIs who participated in inputting into the public policy issues, and the global community who also contributed to the public policy issues that we discussed today. So with that, thank you very much for coming to our session, and that concludes this main session on cybersecurity. If I could ask the panelists to please go up to the front where we'll take a group picture. And we're done.
Thank you to Sala, our marvelous moderator.